Dakota Territory, 1875. The frontier was a place of ruthless contrasts where a single sunset could set the heavens ablaze, and a single gunshot could end a life before the echo faded. This was not a tale of celebrated gunfighters or badge-wearing legends. It was the story of one woman standing alone, an oath long forgotten, and a blood debt settled not with bullets, but with honor. It was about how a quiet act of courage, inside a remote cabin, forged an alliance strong enough to defy a land tearing itself apart, and how that protection became both refuge and prison. The wind carried voices in the Black Hills of Dakota. Most newcomers from Ohio's calm farmlands or New York's crowded streets heard nothing but a hollow wail that shook their walls and nerves. But Clara Whitlock, who had lived alone on her homestead for 3 years since fever claimed her husband Miles Whitlock, understood its language. She heard warnings in its low murmur through the pines, felt winter's threat in its sharp edge across the plains. And on that afternoon she heard something different. It was not the wind. It was distress. A broken, uneven breath carried on the air. Her homestead was a fragile island in disputed territory. To the east lay towns like Custer City, mud-soaked streets, crawling with gold-hungry prospectors and jittery merchants. To the west and in every direction beyond rose the sacred hills of the Apache lands promised by treaty, then stolen by the very men who signed them. Miles had chosen this place for its isolation, believing the clean air would keep their lungs strong. Instead, it became Clara's inheritance, 160 acres of silent grief and unfinished love. She stood on her porch, a tall, slender woman of 30, her face shaped by hardship too early in life. Despite the calluses earned from splitting wood and working soil, her hands were unnaturally steady, a gift from her watchmaker father, and sharpened by years assisting her husband in medicine. Then she heard it again. A strained, guttural sound drifted from the creek bordering the southern edge of her land. It was no animal. It was human. Fear tightened in her gut. Instinct told her to bolt the door, load the double-barreled shotgun Miles had forced her to master. A woman alone invited danger here, and not all predators wore fur. But another instinct rose stronger, drowning the first. The doctor's instinct. "You don't ask who they are," Miles used to say, his hands stained red from saving lives. "You ask where it hurts." Clara grabbed the worn leather medical satchel from its hook. Inside lay Miles's instruments, scalpels, forceps, needles, gut thread alongside her own supplies, dried yarrow to stop bleeding, willow bark to dull pain. She slipped a Colt Peacemaker into her skirt waistband and stepped off the porch, her heartbeat pounding like hooves in her ears. The path to the creek sank into shadow. Tall ponderosa pines swallowed the fading daylight. The air grew cold and damp. The sound sharpened now, a low, broken groan. She parted the wild willow branches and saw him. He was Apache. There was no mistaking it. High cheekbones, long black hair tangled with sweat and dirt, buckskin leggings soaked dark. He was barely 20, his face twisted in agony, lying on his side with his back against a granite boulder. His hands clutched his right thigh where thick blood poured through torn leather, pooling beneath him. His eyes were shut, breath shallow and uneven. Nearby lay a bow and quiver, one arrow snapped clean in half. Clara froze. This was more than an injured man. This was a declaration of war, an Apache warrior bleeding on land, illegally opened by the U.S. government. Helping him could brand her a traitor. Soldiers and prospectors spoke of the Apache with poisoned tongues, fear and hatred blended together. Being labeled an Indian lover meant exile, or worse. She could turn back. No one would ever know. The wind would be the only witness. She stepped away, fingers hovering near her pistol. Then his eyes opened, dark, dazed, burning with pain. Yet when they met hers, there was no hatred, no threat, only a raw, desperate plea to live. In that instant, he was not a warrior, not an enemy. He was a dying boy alone on cold ground. Miles's voice echoed in her head. Where does it hurt? Damn you, Miles, she whispered to his memory. Clara knelt beside him, fear draining away, replaced by focus. It's all right, she said softly, knowing he wouldn't understand the words, but hoping he'd trust the sound. I'm here to help. Don't move. Nako's eyes widened the instant Clara Whitlock reached toward his leg. Suspicion flashed across his face, sharp and instinctive. A low warning sound rumbled in his chest as his body tensed. Easy, Clara whispered, lifting both hands, slowly palms open, so he could see she carried no threat. She gestured to the worn medical satchel, then pointed carefully to his wounded thigh. Medicine, she said, pressing her fingers briefly to her own chest. Doctor, despite the pain clouding his features, Nako studied her closely. His gaze was alert, calculating far from weak. He seemed to weigh two fates bleeding out alone beneath the trees, or trusting his life to a strange white woman in the wilderness. After a long silent moment, he gave the faintest nod. The first step was exposure. The buckskin leggings were stiff heavy with drying blood. There was no way around it, she would have to cut them away. Clara reached into the satchel and drew out the heavy shears. At the glint of steel, his muscles tightened again. Just cloth, she murmured quickly. Only the leather. She demonstrated with a careful snipping motion in the air before bringing the shears close, keeping the blades well clear of his skin. His dark eyes followed every movement as she sliced upward along his thigh, the thick buckskin parting with harsh, deliberate cuts. When the wound was finally revealed, Clara had to swallow hard to keep from gasping. It was a gunshot wound, large and brutal. The entry hole on the front of his thigh was jagged and blackened, but the real devastation lay behind it. The bullet had torn its way out, leaving a cavern of shredded muscle and splintered bone. It was astonishing he was still alive. The damage bore the unmistakable mark of a high-powered rifle, the kind favored by buffalo hunters who were wiping out the Apache way of life along with the herds. He would not survive the night out here. Infection. Blood loss or predators would finish what the bullet had started. Moving him was dangerous. Leaving him was a death sentence. We have to move, Clara said quietly, more to herself than to him. She mimed standing, raising herself slightly as she spoke. Can you stand? Nako tried. He braced his hands against the ground and pushed upward, but the moment he shifted his weight, agony ripped through him. He cried out sharply and collapsed back against the stone, his face drained of color, sweat breaking across his skin. There was no choice. Clara was strong for her size, hardened by years of frontier survival, but he was solid-muscled despite his lean frame. She positioned herself behind him, sliding her arms beneath his, bracing her stance. With a raw cry of effort, she hauled him upright. Nako screamed, an unfiltered sound of pain, swallowed by the forest. He tried to bear weight on his good leg, but dizziness overtook him. What followed was not walking, but a brutal half-drag, half-carry through the trees. They stopped every few yards, both gasping for breath. Blood dripped steadily onto the forest floor, marking their path in dark red, an unmistakable trail leading straight to her cabin. Anyone could follow it. By the time they reached the homestead, the sun was little more than a dying ember along the horizon. Clara's muscles burned as fiercely as his shattered leg. She guided him through the doorway and lowered him onto the bare hide rug near the cold hearth. His body went limp. For a moment she stood over him, chest heaving, her dress soaked with his blood. The weight of what she had done crashed over her. An Apache warrior lay bleeding inside her home. A blood trail stretched from the creek to her door. In a land where suspicion ruled and violence settled. Most questions she had just written her own death warrant. She slammed the door shut, dropped the heavy bar into place, and covered the windows with thick blankets. Then she lit the lantern and turned back to the unconscious man. Instinct and training rising to the surface. The world outside with its treaties, hatred, and guns could wait. Tonight, Her entire world was this cabin, and her only purpose was to hold death at bay. The night became a brutal war fought beneath the flicker of a single kerosene lamp. Clara worked with frantic determination, her thoughts racing with memories of Miles Whitlock's lessons. First stop the bleeding, then clean the wound. She heated water on the cast iron stove, mixing in calendula and the precious salt she usually saved for curing meat. Nako remained unconscious, his breathing shallow and uneven. As she washed away dirt and dried blood, the full horror of the injury became clear. The bullet had shattered its fragments, buried deep in torn muscle. "God help us," she whispered. Setting a break this severe was far beyond her experience. Miles had done such things, his strong hands guiding broken limbs with calm certainty. Now there was only her. She found Miles's laudanum and forced a few careful drops between Nako's lips, praying it would dull the agony without killing him. Then she gathered the wooden splints and clean linen bandages. Bracing herself, she gripped his lower leg and pulled. Even unconscious Nako let out a deep animal sound of pain. His body arched as the broken bone shifted. Clara felt the sickening grind beneath her hands. Sweat streamed into her eyes as she pulled again, harder, trying to bring the main pieces of the femur into alignment. Her muscles screamed. It felt like forcing a shattered tree branch back together. She worked by touch alone, fingers probing mangled flesh, guiding fragments into place. At last she felt it, a soft, wet click as the bone settled, as well as it ever would. She did not let go. Keeping the limb steady with one hand, Clara Whitlock worked quickly with the other, securing the wooden splints in place. Linen strips were wrapped tight and precise, binding the leg from hip to ankle until it could no longer move. The bone was set for now, but the greater danger still lurked beneath torn flesh. Infection. The exit wound was a ruin. She heated her forceps in the lantern flame until the metal glowed faintly, then began the slow, brutal task of cleaning the damage. One by one, she extracted fragments of lead-splintered bone and scraps of buckskin driven deep into the muscle. Each piece removed felt like a small victory stolen from the jaws of gangrene. When she was done, she packed the wound with a thick poultice of crushed yarrow and garlic, the remedy Miles Whitlock had trusted above all others, and bound it tight. At last, exhaustion overtook her. Clara sank back onto her heels. The cabin floor told the story of the night, blood-soaked rags, discarded tissue, and a basin of pink-tinged water. Nearby, the warrior's breathing had deepened, steady and rhythmic. His fever still burned hot, but he was stable. He was alive. Clara spent the rest of the night seated in a wooden chair, the shotgun resting across her lap, her eyes never leaving him as he drifted in and out of restless sleep. Sometime near midnight, he stirred. Nako's eyes opened clear, now no longer clouded by shock. He looked down at his splinted leg, then slowly lifted his gaze to her. He spoke softly in his own tongue, the word curious, uncertain. Clara shook her head. "I don't understand." She touched her chest. "My name is Clara." He watched her mouth carefully, then repeated the sound, clumsy but close. "Clara." Then he tapped his own chest. "Nako." "Nako," she echoed. The name felt solid, grounded, like stone. It was the first fragile bridge between their worlds. Over the next 2 days, a quiet routine settled in. Clara cleaned the wound, forced broth and willow bark tea past his lips to fight fever and pain. Though weak and unable to rise, Nako watched her with intense focus, tracking how she fed the fire, how she kneaded bread, how she whispered to herself when worry crept in. They spoke with gestures. He pointed to the water bucket when thirsty pressed a hand to his bandages, when pain surged. In return, she learned Apache words for water and pain, repeating them softly as she worked. Two people born to opposing sides of a violent world, sheltered for a time within the thin wooden walls of one small cabin. That fragile calm shattered on the third morning. Hoofbeats. Not cautious like deer, confident, steady, more than one rider. Clara's blood turned cold. She rushed to the window, peering through a narrow gap in the blanket. 3 men rode up the path toward her home. The man in front needed no introduction. Grant Hollis. Hollis was a man who had carved fear into the territory. Former buffalo hunter. Former Army scout. Now owner of a broad, ill-defined stretch of land bordering hers to the east. He called it ranching. Everyone else knew better: whiskey smuggling rigged deals, stolen cattle. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, pale eyes that missed nothing, a smile that never reached them. Months earlier he had approached Clara after Miles's death, suggesting they combine properties for her protection. She had refused him outright. The smile he gave her then had been poisonous. He hadn't returned since, but men like Hollis never forgot rejection. "Nako," she hissed, turning from the window. "You must be silent." "Completely." She drew a finger across her throat in warning. "Bad men." His eyes hardened instantly. The healer vanished. The warrior returned. Grimacing through pain, he reached for the small knife still strapped at his belt, the one Clara had not had the heart to remove. He nodded once, jaw set. A heavy fist slammed against the door. "Mrs. Whitlock." "Clara." "You in there?" a voice called. "It's Grant Hollis. Just stopping by like a good neighbor." Clara inhaled slowly, forcing calm onto her face. She slid Nako's knife beneath the edge of the hide rug and draped a quilt over his lower body, concealing the splint. The shotgun was moved out of sight, though the revolver remained tucked into her skirt. "Just a moment, Mr. Apache." "Hollis," she called, her voice pitched higher than she liked. She cracked the door open, blocking the interior with her body. "To what do I owe the visit?" Hollis tipped his hat, his smile slick and practiced. "Checking on my favorite neighbor. A man worries about a lady all alone out here. Heard some noise down by the creek a couple of days back. Sounded like a shot, maybe someone yelling." His eyes slid past her, searching the dim cabin. "Thought I'd make sure you were all right." Behind him, the other 2 riders, weighted rifles resting against their saddles, eyes sweeping her land. "I'm quite fine," Clara replied, forcing steadiness into her tone. "Must have been a cougar. I heard it myself," Grant Hollis said smoothly. "Sounds mighty human when something's hurting." His smile stretched wider. "A cougar, huh? Funny thing is, I was tracking a different kind of animal. Shot myself a red one down by the creek. Winged him real good, but the slippery bastard crawled off." He leaned closer. "Left a blood trail even a blind man could follow. Funny how it seems to end right about here. You haven't seen some stray Apache limping around, have you? Big hole in his leg?" The easy cruelty in his voice made Clara Whitlock's stomach knot. She knew then, without doubt. He was the one who had fired the shot. He had tried to kill Nako like an animal from ambush. Her fingers brushed the pistol at her waist. "Mr. Hollis," she said, her voice dropping into a hard, even calm. "I've lived on this land for 3 years. I've seen things that would sour your appetite. But I have never once seen an Apache on my property." She met his gaze without blinking. "And if I ever did, my shotgun would speak before you ever got the chance." It was a lie, and she wrapped it in exactly the prejudice he expected to hear. Hollis studied her face, pale eyes, searching for the smallest crack. For one terrifying heartbeat, Clara thought he saw through her. "Is that so?" he said at last. "Mind if I come in for a drink of water?" Tracking makes a man thirsty. It wasn't a request. This was the moment. Everything balanced on. Refusing him would be an admission. Letting him inside could get them both killed. "Of course," Clara replied, stepping back and opening the door wider. "Hospitality's about the only luxury I still have." She turned away to reach for a tin cup, deliberate, calculated. Showing her back made her vulnerable, but it also projected a confidence she prayed would disarm him. The cabin was small, too small. The instant Hollis stepped inside, his boots thudded loudly against the wooden floor. His eyes went straight to the shape beneath the quilt. "Well now," he drawled, "looks like you've got company." My cousin's boy, Clara said without turning, her heart pounding so hard she feared he'd hear it. Caught a bad fever coming down from Laramie. I'm trying to sweat it out of him. Hollis moved slowly toward the hearth spurs, chiming like a funeral bell. He stopped over, Nako staring down. Nako did not move. His eyes stayed closed, his breathing shallow and uneven, the perfect imitation of sickness. Clara held her breath. The quilt hid the splint, but the shape beneath it was wrong. The air carried the sharp scent of herbs and blood, too sharp. A smell Hollis might know. He looks awful dark for kin, Hollis said softly, his hand drifting toward the edge of the quilt. Then a voice called from outside. Hey, boss, over here. Looks like that blood trail you were talking about. Guess she must have dripped some hauling firewood. The words shattered the room. Hollis's head snapped up. The false friendliness vanished, replaced by eyes cold as riverstone. You lying bitch, he hissed. He didn't reach for the quilt. He lunged for her. The cabin erupted into chaos. Hollis moved fast, hunter fast. His hand clamped around Clara's wrist, twisting hard enough to tear a cry from her throat. The cup smashed against the floor. Should have known you was a traitor. He snarled, his face inches from hers, breath reeking of cheap whiskey. Once I finish your red pet, you and me are going to have a long talk. But he had made one fatal mistake. He had forgotten the man on the floor. With a roar of raw, primal fury, Nako exploded into motion. Ignoring the agony in his leg, he tore the quilt aside, exposing the splint and the knife at his belt. In one smooth movement, he drew the blade and slashed. The knife was short but viciously sharp. It ripped through Hollis's trousers and buried itself deep in his calf. Hollis screamed shock and pain, breaking his grip for just a heartbeat. It was enough. Clara drove her heel down on his instep, crushing bone. As he recoiled, she yanked free and stumbled backward toward the wall where the shotgun waited. Nako tried to rise to finish it, but his shattered leg betrayed him. He collapsed with a guttural moan, pain twisting his face. Bleeding and enraged Hollis turned on him, dragging out his massive Bowie knife. You'll die for that, you filthy savage, he bellowed. He took a limping step toward the hearth, raising the blade. Grant Hollis. Clara's voice cracked through the room like thunder. He froze. She stood by the fireplace, both barrels of the greener shotgun leveled straight at his chest. Her face was pale, but her hands did not shake. The softness in her eyes was gone, replaced by flint-hard resolve. Get out of my house, Clara! Whitlock shouted, her voice shaking with fury. Grant Hollis stared at her, then at the twin black mouths of the shotgun aimed at his chest. He was a bully by nature, but not a fool. He understood that a cornered woman with a loaded gun was deadlier than any grizzly. Slowly he lowered his knife. You've made yourself a powerful enemy today, Clara, he murmured, venom dripping from every word. This isn't over. It is for today, she replied, her aim never wavering. Tell your men to back away from my home. Now. Hollis retreated step by careful step toward the door, his eyes never leaving her. Mount up, he barked over his shoulder. We're leaving. He shot Clara one last look, a promise of future violence, then slipped outside. Moments later, the thunder of hooves tore across the land as 3 horses fled at full gallop. Only when the sound vanished into the distance did Clara finally breathe. The shotgun suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She leaned it against the wall as her knees gave out, sliding down to the floor, her whole body trembling. Nako was watching her, his chest rising and falling hard. The wildfire of battle had drained from his eyes, replaced by something she had never seen there before: reverence. He spoke a single word in Apache, his voice low and solemn. Wichasha Wakan. Later he would tell her it meant holy woman, spirit woman. In that moment, Clara only knew that something irreversible had passed between them. A line had been crossed. She was no longer only his healer, she was his protector. And by doing so she had declared war on men like Grant Hollis. Clara crawled to Nako, her training taking hold again. The sudden movement had torn his wound open. Fresh blood darkened the bandages. "You fool," she whispered, anger and relief tangling in her voice. "You magnificent fool. You could have shattered your leg all over again." Her hands shook as she worked to redress the wound. As she did, Nako reached up and gently brushed her hair aside. The touch was so unexpected, so tender that it stopped her cold. He said nothing, but his eyes carried a depth of gratitude that words could never reach. They both knew Hollis would return. A man like him would never swallow humiliation. Next time he would bring more men, and he wouldn't knock. They were living on borrowed time. The rest of the day passed in tight, suffocating silence. Every breath of wind sounded like approaching riders. Every shadow seemed alive with threat. As dusk bled across the sky in bruised purple and burning orange, Nako grew restless. His gaze stayed fixed to the west. Suddenly he seized Clara's arm, his grip strong despite his injuries. "They come," he said, one of the few English words he knew. "They come." Her heart dropped. Hollis Nako shook his head and pointed west toward the heart of the sacred hills. Apache. My people. There had been no signal, no messenger, yet he was certain. He pushed himself upright, bracing against the wall, and began to chant softly a low rhythmic prayer that filled the cabin with a heavy, sacred stillness. Clara couldn't tell whether she felt relief or dread. The arrival of the Apache could mean salvation, or slaughter if Hollis returned at the same time. Night stretched on an open abyss of uncertainty. Clara barred the door, reloaded the shotgun, and took her seat opposite Nako, keeping watch. Two warriors from different worlds waiting for dawn. The first pale line of morning crept along the eastern horizon, and with it came a sound. Not gunmen, not Hollis. It was the muted earth-soft tread of many unshod ponies, felt more than heard. Clara went to the window. Her breath caught in her throat. They emerged from the pre-dawn mist like spirits, more than 30 Apache warriors, silent and unyielding, faces painted for war. Bows, lances, and rifles gleamed faintly in the gray light. At their head rode a man who commanded authority without uttering a word. He was older, his face etched with sun and sorrow, his long hair streaked with silver. An eagle feather war bonnet flowed down his back, a mark of immense honor. This was no raiding party. This was a chief. The warriors spread out, surrounding the cabin in a wide, silent circle. They did not attack. They simply waited, watching. Their stillness was more terrifying than any battle cry. The cabin door creaked open. Using the wall and a piece of firewood as a crutch, Nako dragged himself upright. He stood in the doorway, framed by lantern light, and called out a single word: "Father." The chief's iron expression shattered, replaced by raw relief. He dismounted at once and strode forward, his warriors parting before him. He reached Nako, gripping his son's shoulders, eyes scanning the crude splint, the pale strain in his face. He had found him alive. He spoke quickly in Apache, his voice a deep, rolling current of questions and worry. Nako answered, weak but steady. He spoke at length of the ambush by the creek, the blinding pain, the long crawl through brush and blood, and the woman who had refused to let him die. As he talked, he motioned back toward the cabin, toward Clara Whitlock, who stood frozen near the hearth, the shotgun still locked in her hands. The chief followed his son's gesture and for the first time fixed his gaze on her. His eyes were sharp and penetrating, as if they could strip away flesh and fear alike, measuring every choice she had made. He took in the blood on the floor, the scattered medical tools, the shotgun, the strain etched into her face, where terror and defiance collided. He stepped past his son and entered the cabin. He was tall, broad, and his presence seemed to drain the air from the room. He stopped directly in front of her, his shadow swallowing her whole, while his warriors remained outside the door, utterly silent. The fate of the white woman now rested entirely in this man's hands. He could honor her for saving his son. or kill her for belonging to the people who were tearing his world apart. Outside, the sun climbed higher, pouring long shafts of gold through the open doorway. A new day was breaking, but for Clara it felt as if the world itself had paused, waiting for judgment. The chief stood before her, a living monument of authority. His name was Redhorn, a name known and feared by the U.S. Army, a name spoken with reverence among the Apache. He was a man who had watched treaties crumble like ash and buried too many sons of his people. Sorrow lived in him, heavy and old. His gaze swept over Clara, her tangled hair, the blood soaking her dress, the shotgun clenched with white-knuckled tension. Then he looked to Nako, leaning weakly in the doorway. He studied the carefully set splint, the clean bandages, the bowl of herbs. Finally, his eyes settled on the dark stain on the floor where Grant Hollis's blood had mixed with his son's. He saw not only healing, he saw defiance. A line drawn. Redhorn spoke at last, his voice a low, gravel-deep command that seemed meant for more than just the room. The words were in Apache, directed at his son, yet heavy enough for the universe to hear. Nako translated, his strength growing as he spoke. "My father asks, who did this to me?" Clara swallowed. "A man named Grant Hollis," she said quietly. "He shot you from hiding. He came here," she continued, her voice barely above a breath. "He was hunting him. He would have killed us both." Nako relayed her words. The chief's eyes narrowed, cold fire flaring within them. The name Hollis was not new to him. It was spoken with bitterness, linked to poisoned water, whole stolen land, and the trade of firewater that had destroyed too many young warriors. Redhorn's gaze shifted to the shotgun in Clara's hands. He spoke again. Nako translated. "My father asked why you did not use this on me when I was brought here." Clara's throat went dry. How could she explain the war inside her, the memory of her husband, the flicker of humanity in a dying boy's eyes? At last she spoke. "My husband was a doctor," she said. "He taught me that a person in need has no tribe. They're just a life waiting to be saved. Or lost." She lifted her chin. "I chose to save." Nako translated. The words were few, but their weight was heavy. The hard lines of Redhorn's face softened just slightly. He stepped closer. Clara flinched, her finger tightening on the trigger. He stopped, lifting one hand, palm open, the universal sign of peace. He spoke again, his tone gentler now. Nako translated, emotion thick in his voice. "My father says, in a world where your people see us only as animals to be hunted, you saw a human being. He says your husband's spirit is strong in this house." Then Redhorn did something that stole Clara's breath. With solemn care, he reached up and removed a single eagle feather from his war bonnet, a golden tail feather, tipped in black, its base wrapped in red-dyed porcupine quills. This was no ornament. It was a mark of honor, a symbol of courage, a sacred bond to the Great Spirit. He stepped forward and held it out to her. "He offers this to you," Nako said. "It means you are a friend to our people, that this house is a place of peace." Slowly trembling, Clara lowered the shotgun and reached out. The feather felt almost weightless in her hand, yet carried a gravity she could barely understand. Redhorn was not finished. He turned and issued a sharp command. 2 warriors dismounted at once and entered the cabin. Despite their fearsome appearance, their movements were careful, respectful. Working quickly, they fashioned a litter from a blanket and sturdy branches. With practiced gentleness, they lifted Nako, preparing to carry him home. They would carry him home. As the warriors prepared to depart, Redhorn turned back one final time. He placed his fist over his heart and began to speak, not in the steady, conversational voice from before, but in the deep, formal cadence of a sacred oath. His eyes never left Clara Whitlock's. His words rose and fell, filling the small cabin, spilling outward into the pale morning light, meant not only for her, but for the hills, the sky, and the spirits that watched over all things. From the litter, Nako awe written across his face translated. I, Redhorn, chief of the Apache, he declared, swear this vow before the Great Spirit and the ancestors who walk behind me. His voice grew stronger. The woman who lives on this ground, the woman with the hands of a healer and the heart of a warrior, is under my protection. He lifted his arm and pointed deliberately to the four edges of her land. This land she calls her own, from the creek in the south to the ridge in the north, from the rising sun to the setting sun, is Wakan. Sacred. It shall not be harmed. My people will not hunt here. They will not walk this ground with weapons, unless it is to defend it. His gaze sharpened, burning hot. Any man, white or Apache, who comes to this place to bring harm to this woman does not face her alone. He faces me. He faces my people. We will be the shadow that follows him. We will be the wind that speaks his name. We will be the arrow that finds him in the night. This I swear on the honor of my people. This protection is eternal until the grass no longer grows and the rivers no longer flow. He finished with his hand still raised. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the call of a morning bird. The weight of his words settled over the homestead like an unseen force, solid, immovable. He had not merely offered protection. He had declared her land sovereign, claimed beneath his authority. Without another word, Redhorn turned and left the cabin. He mounted his pony in one smooth motion, cast one long look back at Clara standing in the doorway with the eagle feather clutched in her hand, then guided his people west. The silent procession faded into the mist as mysteriously as it had arrived. Clara stood watching long after they were gone. The sun was fully risen now, bathing the valley in clean gold. The land looked unchanged, yet everything was different. She looked down at the feather in her hand. It was a gift, a promise, an alliance sealed by blood and honor. She thought of Grant Hollis. Let him return. Let him bring 100 men. She was no longer a lone woman on a forgotten homestead. She was Clara Whitlock, friend to the Apache, and her land stood beneath the oath of a chief. Strength surged through her, sharp and defiant. But as the rush faded, a thin blade of unease slid into its place. This protection, this sacred vow, what would it cost her? She had been given a shield against one enemy, but in accepting it, she had drawn a line between herself and her own world. Redhorn's oath was a shield, yes. But she sensed it would also become a cage. She went back inside, barred the door, and carefully placed the eagle feather on the mantel beside the tin-type photograph of Miles Whitlock. His smiling face seemed to look toward the feather, and for a brief moment she imagined him nodding in quiet approval. She had lived by his creed. Now she would live with its consequences alone in the vast, unforgiving space between two warring worlds. Redhorn's oath was not loud or theatrical. It was quiet, constant, as ever-present as the wind. In the weeks that followed, Clara saw no Apache warriors. No guards stood watch. No chief returned to check on her. Yet she knew they were there. The first sign came 1 week later. A violent autumn storm tore through the hills, toppling a massive pine that crushed part of her fence and narrowly missed the goat pen. At dawn, she went out dreading the days of brutal labor ahead. But the tree was gone. It had been expertly cut into manageable logs, stacked neatly beside her woodpile. The broken fence posts were set aside ready to be replaced. There were no tracks, no sign of who had done the work. Only a single hawk feather rested atop the stacked wood. Another time, as winter began to bite, she found a freshly killed doe laid gently by her back door, its throat cut clean respectfully. Her own smoked meat was nearly gone. The gift was salvation. No white hunter would have left such a prize, yet the protection carried a darker edge. Word of Grant Hollis's humiliation spread fast, twisted and exaggerated with every telling. To salvage his pride, Hollis claimed he had ridden into an ambush that Clara had been hiding a massive war party inside her cabin. He painted her as a traitor to her own kind, and in doing so he lit a fire that would not burn out easily. When Clara Whitlock rode into Custer City again to buy flour and salt, the change hit her at once. The town had never been gentle, but there had once been a rough kind of frontier courtesy. Now voices dropped the moment she stepped into the general store. Men who used to tip their hats turned away or spat into the dust as she passed. The shopkeeper, a thin, anxious man named Jed Malloy, moved quickly behind the counter, his eyes fixed on the ledgers instead of her face. "That'll be $4, Mrs. Whitlock," he muttered, sliding her goods toward her. "Town feels quiet today," Clara said, watching him closely. Jed hesitated, then finally looked up. There was fear in his eyes and pity. "People are talking, Clara. About you. About the Apache. About Grant Hollis. It's not safe for you to be seen here. What they're saying is a lie," she replied evenly. "Lie or truth?" Jed whispered, leaning closer. "It don't matter in a place like this. What matters is what folks decide to believe. And they believe Hollis. He's got money. Buys a lot of whiskey for a lot of men." He swallowed. "Go home. Stay there." She left town with her head held high, but his words sank deep into her bones. She was an outcast. Her own people now saw her as the enemy. The unseen protection of the Apache had become a wall sealing her off from the world she once belonged to. Grant Hollis never returned to her cabin. He was too proud to risk another confrontation, and too clever to openly challenge Redhorn's name. Instead, he waged a quieter war. He bought the mortgage on the land of her nearest neighbor, a farmer named Rufus Kane, and forced him out, leaving Clara more isolated than ever. He spread rumors that her well was poisoned, that her land was cursed. No prospector crossed her property. No traveler sought shelter at her door. Clara Whitlock became a ghost story. Some called her the Witch of the Black Hills. Others said she had sold her soul to the Apache. She endured. What had once been loneliness hardened into armor. She learned to rely on no one but herself and on the silent, unseen presence that lingered along the ridgelines. Her garden thrived. Her aim with the shotgun grew flawless. She spoke more to the memory of Miles Whitlock and to the animals in her care than to any living soul. Years passed. Then came the Great War of 1876. The land bled. Custer fell at the Little Bighorn. The army flooded the plains, relentless, unforgiving. The Apache were hunted, starved, and driven onto reservations. Yet through all the chaos, Clara's homestead remained untouched, an island of impossible calm. War parties and army patrols alike seemed to bend their roots around her land, as if her 160 acres were marked on some invisible map as a country apart. One bitter winter night, nearly 10 years after she had saved Nako, there came a soft knock at her door. It was the first knock she had heard in years. She lifted the shotgun and opened the door cautiously. An old Apache man stood in the swirling snow, gaunt and fragile, wrapped in a thin, tattered army blanket. It took her a moment to recognize the sharp cheekbones, the familiar eyes. It was Nako. He looked aged beyond his years, broken not by bullets but by defeat. He told her that Redhorn had been killed the year before, shot while resisting removal to the Standing Rock Agency. He told her their way of life was finished, their spirit crushed. He himself was bound for the reservation, a prisoner on his own land. "I came to tell you," he said in careful practiced English. "The oath is ended. My father is gone. Our warriors are scattered. There is no one left to protect you." Clara looked at the man she had once pulled back from death, a figure from a life that felt impossibly distant. She brought him inside, set him by the fire, and fed him stew and fresh bread, just as she had all those years ago. "The oath was never only your father's," she said quietly, her eyes resting on the eagle feather, still on the mantle, its colors bright as the day it was given. "It was a promise between two people in a dark time. It doesn't end with death." She touched her chest. "It lives here. You are welcome in this house. This will always be a place of peace." He stayed 2 days, resting his weary body and spirit. When he left walking east toward the reservation and a diminished future, Clara watched until he was nothing but a fading shape in the snow. She was truly alone now. The magic was gone. The shield was lowered, and yet she felt no fear. The oath had protected her from Hollis, and from war, but solitude had forged something stronger inside her. Something that belonged only to her. She had survived. Clara Whitlock lived on that homestead for another 20 years. She never remarried. She never left. The world shifted and surged around Clara Whitlock. The territory was carved into a state. Dirt roads became rail lines. Settlements swelled into cities. Yet on her small stretch of land, time seemed unwilling to move. She passed quietly in her sleep at 72 years old, the eagle feather folded into her hand. People say that on the day she was laid to rest beside Miles Whitlock, a lone golden eagle appeared high above the hills, circling slowly its cry, carrying across the open sky. Some believed it was a final salute from a chief to a friend, an ancient vow at last completed. You won't find the story of Clara Whitlock and Red Horn written in any official ledger or history book. It lives instead in the breath of wind, moving through the pines in the hush that falls over the Black Hills at dusk. It stands as a reminder that courage, even in the harshest of times, isn't always measured by the fastest draw or the deadliest shot. Sometimes courage is an open door, a steady hand, a decision to recognize humanity where the world insists there is none. It tells us that a single act of compassion can ripple across generations and that a promise sworn in honor binds stronger than any law or treaty ever written. If this forgotten story of the American frontier stirred something in you, consider sharing it with someone who values tales of conviction and quiet bravery. And if you wish to continue exploring the untold legends of the Old West, be sure to follow along so the next journey doesn't pass you by. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover, visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.